Kamikaze Boys. Written by J. Bell. Narrated by Kurt Graves. Chapter 1. A concrete field stretched out before David Henry, a herd of second-hand cars idle in the afternoon sun. The largest of these was a polished SUV, a bull among the cows. Standing proudly next to it was the guy determined to kick his ass. David supposed he could still turn around, escape back into the building, and choose a different exit like he had the day before. Then again, there was no avoiding the 10-minute walk between school and home, where so much could go wrong along the way. Yesterday, he had hoped the exodus of cars and buses would make it too difficult for the bullies to find him. David had just reached his neighborhood when a car approached from behind, engine roaring and horn blaring. One glance over his shoulder was all it took to confirm his worst fears. A big black SUV, and behind the wheel, Chuck Marsh, his own personal nightmare. David had broken into a run to escape, not that it helped. The SUV drove onto the sidewalk, voices howling in amusement as he fled in terror. He'd been forced to race across a perfectly manicured yard and hide behind the 2-story house it belonged to, but even that humiliation was better than another bloody nose. Today, the cruel game began again. Would they catch him this time, or would he get away? David wavered in the entrance to his school, uncertain what to do, until one of the students swarming around him hissed that he should move and shoved him from behind. David stumbled out into a mild Kansas afternoon, the kind he used to love when he was a kid. Too distracted to notice who had jostled him, he looked instead at the slowly emptying parking lot to see if Chuck had left yet. Of course not. Beady eyes were already locked onto his. Even if David re-entered the school, they would know they had him on the run, and they would give chase. Chuck wasn't the most popular guy in school, but he had more status than David did. For one thing, he had friends, plural, a pair flanking him now and hungry for a show. Their lanky frames only made Chuck appear more toadish, like a frog squatting between 2 dandelions. Or like a fat troll, which was exactly the description that had landed David in this mess. These foolishly courageous words escaped his lips in the middle of 4th period math. David's head had been bowed, as always, while he covertly read a fantasy novel hidden behind his pre-calculus book. He'd been nearing the end of a chapter when Chuck reached over and grabbed the novel, taking one look at the cover before tossing it to the floor. "Faggot," Chuck had muttered, and not for the first time. David's face burned when he reached down to pick up the book. On the front was a picture of a long-haired man clutching at a white horse. He had known the stupid cover with its lavender swirls would attract attention. David liked the book anyway, and the art too, if he was honest. But it infuriated him that he couldn't even read without becoming a target. So angry, in fact, that he hadn't considered the consequences of the words he spoke next. Fat troll. Chuck had smirked, David's bravery swiftly replaced by fear, because he knew there would be a price to pay after school. Sure enough, Chuck was glaring at him now, or squinting, like he always seemed to. Maybe he needed glasses but refused to get them, not wanting to be associated with the type of people he enjoyed picking on. He didn't look so tough at first glance. Chuck was pudgy with short brown hair and a swath of freckles across the bridge of his nose. His smiling yearbook photo made him resemble a chubby-cheeked cherub. He wasn't, though. As Chuck leaned against his glistening SUV, he appeared more stocky than fat. It didn't matter how out of shape he was. With size came strength. Taking him on would be like getting into the boxing ring with an ogre. Not that David intended to fight. God only knew what he would do besides whimper as they pummeled him. He could run. They would laugh and pursue, but David would have a head start. He glanced to his left and saw another of Chuck's friends, the one with the long, grungy hair, hovering by the corner of the building while seeming to search for something. So that's how they had found him yesterday. Was picking on him really worth all the effort? That escape route was blocked regardless. The right led towards a sports field next to the school, which would be dangerously deserted by now. They probably had a lookout posted in that direction, too, so David kept moving forward, hoping to find some other opportunity to escape. Chuck wasn't taking any chances today. He stepped into the center of the lane to continue watching him. David had hoped to use a group of students as camouflage and hide behind them until he could duck between rows of parked cars. He would squat walk his way to freedom. But no, he had waited too long. There weren't as many people in the parking lot now, and hardly any vehicles to shield him from sight. Unsure what else to do, David kept moving forward, unable to shake the feeling that he was walking into the open mouth of a shark. There were still witnesses around. Maybe that would be enough to discourage anything bad from happening. No such luck. Chuck was finished playing games and moved to intercept him. "Hey, faggot, you and I need to talk." David's voice came out as a rusty squeak. "Why?" "You owe me an apology." Chuck cracked his knuckles meaningfully. The other guys chuckled, their eager expressions devoid of sympathy. A car honked from behind. David flinched and moved out of the lane, bringing him closer to Chuck's SUV. Bad decision. He should have gone back into the school and pleaded with a teacher to drive him home. That would have made him feel even more pathetic than yesterday, but at least he would have been safe. Now it was too late. Chuck and his friends circled, using the SUV to wall him in completely. David turned his back to it, not daring to take his eyes off his adversaries. His favorite kind of heroes were those who relied on smarts instead of strength. Doctor Who, Sherlock Holmes, Captain Janeway. Perhaps he could draw inspiration from them and talk his way out of this. "Listen, I shouldn't have called you a troll. I was just—" Chuck shoved him. David was right. Someone who weighed that much had a lot of force at their disposal. He stumbled backward, arms pinwheeling, but his backpack threw him further off balance and he fell. David's butt hit the pavement, the backpack scraping along the plastic grille of Chuck's SUV. He doubted the soft fabric did any real damage. Even so, Chuck only had himself to blame. But fairness didn't count in situations like these. The guys surrounding him sucked in air between their teeth. They knew what was coming. David did too. "Get away from my car, faggot," Chuck snarled. "Sorry," David said as he regained his feet. "I didn't mean to—" "I said, get away." Chuck moved forward, fists balled. David braced himself for the inevitable. "What's going on, Marshmallow?" An arm wrapped around Chuck's neck, pulling him down as if he weighed nothing before subjecting him to a noogie. "What are you up to?" the newcomer said. "Causing trouble again? Can I help?" "Get off me!" Chuck pulled away and turned, scowling to see who he was dealing with. Connor Williams, an even bigger monster than Chuck, both figuratively and literally, although not necessarily in regards to height. Connor had the beefy build of a college guy, probably because that's how old he was, if the rumors were true. But for now, he was still stuck in high school, a perpetual senior who never managed to graduate. His green eyes sparkled with amusement as he playfully shoved Chuck, the sun making his buzzed blonde hair glow like he was some sort of deranged sun god. David couldn't remember seeing Chuck and Connor together before, but it wasn't hard to imagine them as friends. He didn't care how well they knew each other, because no matter what, this situation had gone from bad to unbearably worse. "Fuck off, Williams," Chuck mumbled, keeping his eyes down while glaring at the asphalt. His friends, whom Connor hadn't even acknowledged, shifted uncomfortably. David didn't blame them. Connor Williams was a psychopath, and everyone knew it. That made him unpredictable. Connor might laugh and wander off, or he could be seconds away from killing them all. A black eye and a few bruises didn't sound so bad by comparison. "What's going on?" David realized that Connor was addressing him, and felt the blood drain from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "This asshole," Chuck said, having recovered, "just threw himself at my car." Connor raised an eyebrow. "Weird. To me it looked like you pushed him." As if to demonstrate, Connor shoved Chuck again. This time he didn't seem to be holding back. Chuck stumbled but managed to stay standing. "He's a fag," he said, as if this justified his actions. Connor might think it did. If one word could turn other people against him, that was it. The slur had accompanied David for most of his teenage life. By junior high, everyone seemed to have figured it out, even before he had. Connor looked at David. "Really?" Then he cocked his head, flashed a crazed grin, and turned back to Chuck. "Funny, 'cause I'm a fag too." Chuck swallowed. "Shut up." "Seriously," Connor insisted. "Push me next." He moved to the front of the SUV. David scurried away to avoid him, but he was ignored as Connor stood with his back to the hood and spread his arms wide. "Go on. Push me. Push the faggot." Chuck shook his head and groped in his pockets for the keys while mumbling that he needed to be somewhere. His friends followed his lead and piled into the vehicle. Connor stayed put, turning to stare at Chuck through the windshield. The engine came to life, but still he held his ground, as if daring Chuck to run him over. David wasn't interested in sharing this fate. He pressed himself against the neighboring car, tense as he waited for the situation to reach critical mass. It didn't. Connor finally stepped aside, allowing Chuck to speed out of the parking lot. David wished his adrenaline would let up. His heart was still thudding, his body drenched in sweat. Connor turned toward him, increasing the temptation to run. "That your car?" he asked. "No," David croaked. "I don't have one." "Want a ride?" David stared at him, waiting for some bizarre twist to this offer, but Connor no longer looked as unhinged as he had a minute ago. He seemed more in control now, his expression stone cold, which only made him more intimidating. The hint of stubble on his chin and the scar running from his jaw to his Adam's apple reminded David of the legends that followed in his wake. Not only was Connor older, but he also bore the mark of his most heinous crime. If David got into that car, he would probably be driven to the edge of town to play some hellish game. He imagined himself running through the woods, fleeing from maddened laughter and insane green eyes. "No," he answered. "I mean, thanks anyway. I have to go now." David turned and walked away while keeping his head down, certain that Connor would attack him at any moment. His muscles remained tense until he reached the edge of the parking lot. When he made it to the other side of the street, only then did he dare glance back. Connor Williams had disappeared, returning to wherever bad dreams come from. The condos where David lived weren't far from his school, the walk just long enough for him to regain control of his nerves. What a mess he had gotten himself into. If he could travel back in time, he'd keep his mouth shut in math class. Or maybe he would go even further back and leave the gay fantasy novel at home. Then again, getting to watch someone push Chuck around was almost worth all the stress. David could still remember the first time he had seen Connor. His ninth-grade history class had been in the library, doing research for a project on ancient civilizations. The girl David was partnered with had gasped and pointed across the worn desks to the old card catalog system that nobody used anymore. Standing there, flipping through the index cards with his back to them, was Connor. "He used to go to the same junior high as me," the girl had said. "That was before we moved to this side of town. He's psycho. They sent him to juvenile hall for a whole year." "For what?" He still remembered the girl's excitement, as if she had hoped David would ask this. "He tried to kill his dad," she whispered. "And he almost did. The guy survived, but now he's crippled. Seriously? Yep, I can prove it too. Wait until he turns around. You'll see a scar on Connor's throat from when a couple of guys tried to kill him. It happened while he was still locked up. They were stupid to mess with him. He nearly beat them to death. Ignoring their work, they had sat there and waited for Connor to turn around. When he finally did, David was surprised at how human he appeared. Handsome, even, in a rough sort of way. Then he noticed the scar and knew the stories were true. David shook away the memories and hoped that, like most people in school, Connor would soon forget he existed. Besides, he had seemed more interested in messing with Chuck, who might have also opened his mouth at the wrong time and attracted the anger of a bigger fish. People who had survived high school were often dismissive of the experience, but for those still trapped there, each day could be a vicious battle for survival. David, as the lowest on the social food chain, knew this all too well. Lowest except for Gordon, who didn't even make the chart. He was already sitting on the front steps of the condo waiting for David to return home. Gordon was like a kid brother to him, although the difference in the color of their skin ruled out any blood relation. Gordon's family was of Pakistani descent, while David was mostly Greek and French, according to his father anyway. All he saw when looking in the mirror was an awkward white guy. And when looking at Gordon, all he saw was his best friend. Only a year's difference in age separated them, but Gordon's chubby cheeks and goofy bowl haircut made him appear younger than he actually was. It didn't help that he was homeschooled, which probably accounted for his socially awkward demeanor. David didn't mind. Gordon was fun to hang out with. He often wished that they went to school together. The reason Gordon's parents kept him at home remained a mystery. They weren't overly religious and seemed like fairly normal people. Maybe their formative years had also been rough, and they wanted to spare their son the same pain. David sometimes felt a little sorry for Gordon, but on days like these, he was envious. His only comfort came from the calendar, since it was May. Only a little longer until summer break, and a lot less anxiety. "I think I understand why we can't steal the dragon armor from the orcs," Gordon said, standing up and unselfconsciously tugging the wedgie from his cargo shorts. This task completed, he held up a video game strategy guide. "We haven't completed the quest for the crystal chalice yet." "I thought it was optional," David said. "It is, but not if you want the dragon armor." David unlocked the condo's front door and held it open. So what if Gordon was a little weird? At least David felt comfortable around him. Much of that came from knowing what to expect. They normally stuck to the same daily rituals, tried and true. After grabbing a juice box from the fridge, they would go downstairs to his bedroom, where David would play video games while Gordon pored over his most recent strategy guide. His friend treated these books like Bibles, reacting with shock if David ever went against their advice. He seemed to enjoy the guides more than the actual games. This routine was rarely broken. Only occasionally would the fantasy games and novels inspire them to go out for a hike. On such outings, they would stroll through the woods, discussing their favorite plots or pretending that they themselves had crossed over to a magical realm, but usually they kept it simple and stayed at home. David opened the door to his room and breathed out a sigh of relief. This was his sanctuary, a sacred place that the madness of the world couldn't penetrate. Only here did he let himself relax. The blinds were pulled, as usual, to create the illusion of night outside. The walls were dark, too, every square inch covered with posters and pages torn from magazines. Some represented David's hobbies, others were photos of remote locations he hoped to visit someday. Egypt, Greece, China, anywhere but here. These days, there were images of male models, too, since he no longer had anything to hide. David plugged in a string of lights, a plastic jalapeno covering each bulb that cast a cozy glow over the room. He thought about how many memories he had made here. Most were trivial, but some were deeply important to him. Gordon was the first person David had come out to. Tired of waiting for an ideal time, which was non-existent as far as he could tell. He had simply paused the game they were playing and blurted out, "I'm gay." Gordon's face had scrunched up in response. "I'm not. But you're okay with it?" Gordon thought about it, shrugged, and nodded. Simple as that. They resumed their game, and the topic had rarely come up since. Then again, Gordon had been the one to loan him the fantasy novel with the lavender cover and a gay main character. That couldn't be a coincidence. So David took it as a supportive gesture. "I'm looking forward to playing today," he said, feeling a surge of warmth for his friend. "I'm excited, too." Gordon took his usual seat on the edge of the bed and flipped through the pages of his guide. "There are some good treasures on the Chalice quest that will help us later on. I couldn't wait for you to get home." "Me neither." The game console hummed and purred as it booted up. David sat on the bed, still marveling at how different his two worlds were. "You're lucky you don't have to go to school." "I know," Gordon replied, even though he truly didn't. "Any plans for the weekend?" Gordon sat up straight, a rare event. "I got a birthday card in the mail from my aunt. I haven't opened it yet, but she always sends me money." "Sweet." "Yeah, I thought we could go to the mall on Sunday. The new Final Fantasy just came out, and we can hit the used bookstore across the way. Think you can get the car?" David nodded. He hadn't figured out what to buy Gordon for his birthday, but maybe he would find something while at the mall. They spent the next hour gaming, David working the controller while Gordon split his attention between the television screen and the book in his lap. Usually, this was enough to make David forget his troubles. But today, his mind kept wandering back to the confrontation in the parking lot. Chuck would be twice as pissed tomorrow, and David wouldn't be rescued by a convenient distraction. Whatever happened, it was sure to hurt. "Let's call it a day," he said at the next save point. Gordon glanced at the clock, probably because they still had another half hour before David's father came home, but he didn't say anything. He loitered another 10 minutes, discussing the virtual dungeon they would explore next, before he finally left. David closed the door to his room and counted under his breath until he heard the front door slam. Then he turned on his speakers, set the list of his favorite songs to shuffle, and cranked up the volume. He loved to dance. The music didn't matter as much as the rhythm. All he needed was a strong beat. Hip-hop, metal, pop, anything would do. On really bad days, this was the ultimate cure, a surefire way to exorcise his demons while exercising his body. David loved to freak out when he danced, not doubting for a second that bullies would line up around the corner if they could see the way he flailed his arms and spun around, but he didn't care. He was home, the one place he could truly be himself. Craving the darkness that often accompanied this manic meditation, David unplugged the bar lights and continued moving to the rhythm, his world devoid of light but lush with sound. "Did you set the table?" David nodded at his father. He finished filling his glass with tap water before he took his seat at the small square table. For a piece of furniture, it wasn't very optimistic. The table was pushed against a wall and only had enough surface area to accommodate two, implying the owner didn't expect or even want visitors. He had learned to accept that. When his mother first announced her intent to leave, beyond the shock, David had imagined a lazy bachelor's life with his father. Richard Henry would finally loosen his tie and sit with his son in front of the TV every night as they picked at microwave dinners and laughed at stupid comedies. He had assumed his mother's constant nagging and eternally pursed lips had made his father a starchy person. In truth, Richard's inflexibility was probably what had driven her away. He had only gotten worse since then. Richard set 2 plates on the table before taking a seat. Pasta with tomato sauce. Again. On weekends, his father often cooked a big pot of sauce, divvying it into freezer bags for later use. That way, all he had to do on workdays was boil a pot of water for the pasta and toss the sauce bag in the microwave. If his father was feeling energetic, he would add meatballs or throw together a chopped salad instead. Good thing, too, or David probably would have died from malnutrition years ago. Not that he cared much about such things. He would prefer delivery pizza or a greasy bag of fast food, but neither was as cost-effective as the endless parade of pasta. "How was school?" "The usual," David answered between bites. Despite his lack of enthusiasm for the meal, all that dancing had made him hungry. "Only a few weeks until summer break," Richard said. "Any sign of your grades?" "I don't know. Straight A's? Isn't that what I always get?" His father peered at him from over his glasses, chewing carefully before dabbing his trimmed beard with a napkin. "Last semester you received a 91 in math. That's only 2 points away from a B. And only 9 points away from being perfect. That's good considering how terrible I am with numbers, especially this year." "What is it about pre-calculus that you find so challenging?" "The mind-numbing boredom." Having his desk next to the biggest asshole in school didn't help either. If only his dad knew what he went through every day. But David couldn't imagine them discussing it. Then again, why not? That's what parents were for, and it sure beat talking about grades. He set down his fork. "Did anyone pick on you in school?" Richard raised an eyebrow in concern. "Are you having trouble?" David shook his head. "I'm just wondering what it was like for you." "Is that why your grades are slipping?" Ugh, why couldn't they have a conversation instead of his father treating him like a problem that needed to be solved? "My grades are as good as they're going to get. But yeah, there are guys at school who make my life hell. Enough that I don't want to go anymore." His father wiped his mouth again and shook his head. "You can't be homeschooled with Gordon. I know you think that sounds like fun, but I promise you his education isn't as rounded as yours. He certainly won't be getting into a decent university." "I don't want to be homeschooled," David said, his voice starting to rise. "I just want people to leave me the hell alone." As starchy as his dad was, he never had been bothered by what his mother used to call foul language. David used it sparingly enough that when he did, his father took notice. "I can talk to your teachers if you'd like," he said. "No one has the right to pick on you." "It won't help," David said. "Why not?" "Because it's human nature to hate anything that's even remotely different." His father tossed the napkin on his empty plate and sighed. "Is this about your sexual orientation?" "I don't know. Maybe." David hated it when he called it that. Sexual orientation sounded so clinical and devoid of emotion. At least his father didn't have a problem with it, being too logical and pragmatic to have any objections. The truth was, David didn't know why people hated him. At his school, fag and homo were basic insults used without discretion, but with him, people seemed to mean it more. He wasn't particularly feminine, nor had he been caught doing anything with another guy, but people assumed he was gay anyway. They were right, of course, which automatically meant he was alone. David didn't know any other students who were gay, not openly, and what Connor Williams had said earlier was only to mess with Chuck. David was sure of that. People said a lot of crazy things about Connor, but never that he was into guys. "Listen, son. There will always be ignorant people in the world who make life unpleasant for the rest of us. If you want my advice, keep your head down and study hard. Don't let them distract you from your potential. Make something of yourself. When they're hauling away garbage from the curb of your house each week, you'll be glad you didn't sink to their level." For his father, the advice wasn't terrible, but he failed to understand that turning the other cheek would only get David hit on that side as well. Richard was in for a rude awakening. When they sat at this table the next night, he would see the bruises and dried blood. Then he would understand. Maybe tomorrow things would finally get better. Chapter 2. Connor lit another cigarette and considered the ghostly wisps of smoke surrounding him before reaching over to roll down the passenger side window. Sitting in the car for the better part of an hour, all of sixth period, in fact, had left the oxygen level dangerously low. In the corner of his eye, the school doors opened, the students pouring out. Connor lowered the volume on the radio, the knob coming off like it always did, before he turned his attention to the oncoming crowd. He saw Chuck leave the building, surrounded by more minions than usual. Connor allowed himself a cocky smile. Chuck could bring all the reinforcements he wanted. It wouldn't make a difference. When the general was scared, the troops were terrified. Connor leaned the car seat all the way back. Chuck and his lackeys passed without noticing him. They headed for the Chevrolet Suburban that David Henry had been shoved up against yesterday. Chuck even inspected the front for damage, as if needing further justification for his actions before he turned his attention to the school. Connor followed his gaze, shifting his seat back up as he searched for the same person. Out the door came David, walking across the parking lot without making an attempt to hide or run. Except he wasn't feeling brave or planning to make a stand. That much was clear from his body language. His lanky frame was tense with fear, his shoulders hunched. But why? David had a decent build. Standing up straight would make him taller than Chuck, a good advantage in any fight. Instead, he played the quintessential victim. Connor supposed the short curly hair didn't help, since it was a little nerdy, nor did the full lips that somehow made him appear sensitive, like they had become pink and swollen from reading too much poetry aloud. Why was David doing this? He wasn't going to fight, and probably wouldn't even find brave words, but still he marched forward as if determined to meet his fate. Connor looked back at Chuck and saw his little rat eyes glimmering with excitement. He had probably stayed up all night jerking off over his plans to harass people weaker than him. And here David was, willing to make all his fantasies come true. How could he be so stupid? Just as he was passing by, Connor stepped out of his car. When David turned to face him, one of his shoes pivoted on a piece of gravel with a sound like a needle dragging across a vinyl record. "Get in the car." Connor hadn't meant to say it like that, with irritation and hostility. His anger was intended for Chuck, and he was struggling to keep it in check. David glanced between him and the group of bullies, weighing his options while clearly torn over which of them was worse. He must have heard about Connor's past. Not surprising, since there wasn't a soul in this godforsaken shithole who didn't whisper the stories as he walked by. Normally, it didn't bother him, but Connor had hoped that David would be the exception. A fellow outcast, another person too fucked up to fit in anywhere else. "Get in," he tried again, but it wasn't enough. Connor would have to give him a little more. "I have to pick up my brother. He's in grade school." David's brow furrowed, probably in an attempt to reconcile this information with the monster in his mind. One more wary glance toward the bullies finally sealed the deal. David headed for the passenger side door, while Connor kept his eyes on Chuck, making sure he stayed put. And he did, resembling a denied child on the verge of a temper tantrum. Once David was seated, Connor flashed Chuck his biggest smile and got back in the car. Turning the ignition, he let the engine growl a few times before zipping out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, he saw Chuck flip him off and smirked, knowing he'd never have the balls to do that to his face. "I don't live that far from here, actually," David said, clutching the seat with white knuckles. Connor slowed to the speed limit so as not to give him a heart attack. "Just a couple of blocks," David tried again, still seeming nervous. "I can't keep my brother waiting. One detour, then I'll take you home." In truth, he had enough time to drop David off first, but Connor was eager to prove that he was more than what the rumors claimed. If only he could think of something to say. He drummed on the steering wheel, willing his mind to start working. "Sit tight," he managed. "We'll be there soon." "Okay," David said, sounding resigned to his fate. "So, What kind of car is this? It's a 1968 Chevy Chevelle. The car was a piece of crap, the paint stripped down to the gray primer. His uncle, the original owner, once had plans to paint the car. Then he married a woman with 3 kids. With his new minivan life, his uncle sold the Chevelle to him instead. Considering all the rust and engine problems, the car should have been free. Connor couldn't afford anything better anyway, but at least with an old muscle car, people assumed you were in the process of restoring it. Are you fixing it up or something? Right on cue. Yep, some paint and a little work, and she'll be as good as new. Or in the junkyard by the end of the year. But so far the car had held together. The conversation lulled again, so he reached for the radio, only to notice he hadn't picked the knob off the floor yet. Why was this so hard? I'd offer you a cigarette, but we're almost there. I don't smoke with my little brother in the car. I can't stand the smell of them anyway. Great. Not that I mind, David added quickly. No, you're right. Nasty habit. Connor rubbed his chin, wishing he had shaved that morning. Instead, he had eaten his bowl of cereal slowly, picturing a situation similar to this one where he and David ended up hanging out the whole afternoon, chatting nonstop as they got to know each other. In his imagination, everything had been perfect. In real life, he couldn't muster a single damn word. The blinking school zone sign came into view, which meant they were close to picking up Tommy. 2 minutes left to be charming. Now or never. Fuck, he muttered. Connor glanced in the rearview mirror, not surprised to see that his expression was just as hopeless as David's. He hit the turn signal and pulled in behind the cars already waiting there. Tommy spotted him and ran down the sidewalk, even though he was supposed to stay by the door. They shared the same green eyes and blonde hair, except Tommy's, flopping behind him, was still the platinum blonde of childhood, whereas his own had darkened to gold years ago. Tommy sprinted to the car, a doofy grin on his face that turned to puzzlement when he reached the passenger door. You have to get out so I can get in, Tommy said, with all the tact of an 8-year-old. Oh, right. David opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle. You can sit up front if you want. Connor caught his brother's eye and shook his head. Tommy didn't seem concerned either way as he scrambled into the back. Who are you? He asked as the car pulled away from the curb. David. What's your name? Tommy. Are you my brother's friend? David looked over at Connor, appearing amused. Sure. Tommy was far from finished. Do you like comics? Not really. I like to read, though. You like movies? Yeah, especially if they have lots of wizards and magic, like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. David's tastes failed to impress Tommy. The kid had grown up on dubbed Japanese cartoons and had never taken much interest in fantasy. But Connor knew of one exception. Remember that old cartoon we used to watch? He said. The one with the scary frogman? I hated the frogman, Tommy said with a shiver. That's Lord of the Rings. Or I guess technically it was The Hobbit. I liked the songs, Tommy said, sounding unsure if he really did. That's right. Connor glanced over at David. Our sister used to sing along to them in a funny voice. Wait, David said. Do you mean the old Rankin Bass cartoons? Yeah, I remember thinking it was weird that they also did those Christmas specials, like Rudolph, but even those were a little crazy. He hesitated, the word highly loaded, since it was so often applied to him. Crazy Connor. How often had he heard that? Not wanting to dwell on such subjects, he tried to think of other movies that fit the bill. Or how about The Dark Crystal? You won't remember that one, Tommy. You never made it past the first couple of minutes because it scared you too much. Good one, David nodded in approval. That's a classic. Silence reigned supreme for half a second before Tommy heroically vanquished it. What about video games? Do you like those? David did. He started rattling off the names of his favorites, Connor attempting to do the same, even though he rarely played. When the subject died down, Tommy asked more questions that kept the conversation flowing. This was so successful that, by the time they were passing the high school again, Connor was giving serious consideration to getting a tattoo that read, "I love my kid brother." "Turn here," David said. The sign on the subdivision mentioned something about condos, which Connor always pictured as boxy little units stacked on top of each other near a beach. The condos here looked more like townhomes, row after row of two-story buildings that were all connected to each other. Maybe some marketing department had decided that condo sounded fancy, whereas townhome sounded quaint. Either way, Connor was relieved that David didn't live in a big house. The condos weren't likely to be cheap, but at least this put them both in the same financial solar system. "Pull over there," David said, "where that guy is sitting." On the front stoop of a condo was a chubby-faced kid with glasses just as round as his face, his confused expression so intense that it neared revulsion. "Friend of yours?" Connor asked. "Yeah." David grabbed his backpack from the floorboard. "Listen, thanks for the ride, but none of this will make a difference." "You mean with Chuck?" David nodded. "He's just going to beat me up tomorrow." "Not if I give you another ride home." David stared in open surprise. Then he blinked. "That's nice of you, but he won't give up so easily. He'll wait until you're not around, and then I'll be there every day after school, okay? I'll make sure he never lays a finger on you again." The words slipped from Connor's mouth before he had a chance to consider them, and he blessed their careless speed. "Cool?" David nodded and fumbled for the door handle. When he made it out of the vehicle, he spun around to face it, like he suspected this was all some elaborate trick. "Bye," Tommy said to him, clambering through the gap between seats to get to the front. "Bye," David replied numbly, raising a hand and parting. "See you around," Connor said. As soon as they were out of the subdivision, he gunned it toward the west side of town. "I don't think he likes you," Tommy said after a moment. Connor laughed. "That's because your big brother is a scary guy." "I don't think you're scary." Connor grabbed Tommy's stomach, causing him to shriek and giggle, but even this didn't silence his questions. "Do you like him?" Connor thought about it and gave the most honest answer he could. "I don't know. We'll see." Fluorescent light poured through the windshield, bathing Connor's bare chest as he considered the shirt in his hand. He leaned back, the creaking sound of the car seat reminding him of when his father was younger and wore a leather jacket, a brown one. Connor remembered burying his face in it when he was hugging him and inhaling the comforting scent. God, that seemed like ages ago. Connor sighed as he returned to the present and pulled the shirt over his head. Working at McDonald's was bad enough without the crappy uniform. The ugly maroon shirt with its gray and yellow horizontal stripes always smelled like grease, even after washing it, which he didn't do so often anymore. Just as annoying were the boring black slacks that went with it. Connor unbuttoned his jeans and pulled them down to his ankles, kicking off his shoes when they got in the way. He was grasping around in the back seat for his work pants when someone knocked on the door, causing him to jump and almost bang his head on the roof. "Fuck," he said when he saw it was Quinn. "Don't do that." Quinn smiled through multiple lip piercings. "What are you doing in there?" she asked after he rolled down the window. "Jacking off or something?" The idea was definitely more appealing than flipping burgers. Connor laughed humorlessly and got his pants on as quickly as possible. Not that he was shy, but Quinn was staring shamelessly at his package. "Is Mike here already?" he asked, while struggling with the annoyingly small zipper. "Of course." Quinn finally returned her attention to his face. "You know how he lives for this place. I don't think he's noticed you're late yet." "Good." Connor got out of the car and wished she would give him some space. Quinn was standing way too close, but that's how it had been ever since she first started working here a few weeks back. Especially when the others tried warning her about him. This had the opposite intent. She liked his bad reputation. Quinn was a freak, or desperately wanted to be. Her long hair was dyed black, except for a single streak of magenta. her heavy makeup echoing these hues. Of course, this was all a charade. Underneath her Halloween appearance was a normal girl screaming for attention. Connor found this strange. Others had chosen his mask for him. He didn't wear it willingly. Quinn had created her own and was still trying to convince others that it was real. She was okay, though. He liked having someone he could talk to on breaks. Together, they trudged into the fast food citadel. Connor was heading for the grill when his manager walked around it, saw him, and pointed at his watch. Mike's appearance matched his insides, relentlessly organized. His posture was upright, his body thin with discipline, the spiked blonde hair just as straight and pointed as a wooden fence. Connor peered at it now, searching for a single hair that was out of place and unable to find one. The dude was only a few years older than him, but he acted like he was 50. "4th time this month," Mike said, tapping his watch. "I didn't realize you were keeping count," Connor winked. "How sweet." Mike glared at him. "I expect a written explanation as to why you were late. An apology, too. You can write it on your next break." He wasn't kidding. Mike had asked him to do this before, and Connor had complied, because as much as he hated it, he needed this stupid job. Mike stood there staring, as if daring him to talk back, until one of the cashiers came over and asked for his help. The manager finally went away, leaving Connor to face an industrial-sized grill and a cardboard box full of frozen patties. He barely glanced at the order screen. After a year of working here, he could predict how many burgers were needed for each hour of the evening. This left his mind free to think while his body ran on automatic. It didn't take long for his thoughts to drift to David, and his reaction when Connor offered to drive him home every day. Was he relieved? Or afraid? Maybe he wouldn't be in the parking lot tomorrow, or he'd walk right past him instead. Especially when considering that David had stood there trying to decide between him and an entire group of bullies, as if it wasn't an easy choice. What a depressing thought. "Are there pickles on a fillet of fish?" Quinn shouted over the kitchen's din. Connor glanced over at her. "Nope, just cheese and tartar sauce." "Thanks." She smiled as if Connor had just rescued her from a burning building. He didn't return the gesture, focusing on his station with renewed intensity. The last couple of days had been the worst. Quinn, realizing that Connor wasn't likely to strangle her or anything equally deprived, had begun flirting shamelessly. She had absolutely no idea about him. No one did. Connor could roll right up to someone and announce that he was gay, as he had done with Chuck, and nobody would take it seriously. But when someone like David walked down the hall, thoughtful and quiet instead of being a macho asshole, everyone assumed he was gay. People were clueless. All they ever went by was appearance and rumor. Quinn wasn't foolish for dressing the way she did. She wanted to be something she wasn't and understood that all it took was the right costume. She should give David lessons, dress him up in some satanic gear to scare away the bullies. Connor could introduce them. It would probably be love at first sight. "I want a number 3, Williams," Mike boomed at him. "Made the way I like it." Connor nodded. One of the perks of working at McDonald's was getting a free meal with every shift. Smelling the greasy food for hours on end made the prospect less appealing, but even Connor's treacherous stomach gave in when dinner rolled around. His boss was no exception. Mike always ordered the quarter-pounder meal. Plenty of those burgers were on the rack and ready to go, but Mike always insisted that Connor make his fresh. No onions, extra pickles. "I got this one," Connor said, bringing the burger patty to the dressing station. Quinn moved aside as he threw on the usual ingredients: ketchup, mustard, pickles, and cheese. Before putting the bun on, Connor glanced around to make sure they weren't being watched. "Can't forget the secret sauce," he said, before quietly summoning phlegm from the depths of his throat, which he spat right onto the burger patty. He added a bit of extra ketchup to help disguise this before smooshing the bun on top. Quinn covered her mouth, laughing, but also looking green beneath her white makeup. "Funny," Connor said. "I've been reprimanded 4 times this month, and Mike has eaten the secret sauce 4 times. Go figure."
"Remind me never to cross you," Quinn said, sounding breathless.
The rest of his shift wasn't nearly as exciting. Once it was over, Connor pocketed the newest Happy Meal toys. He didn't bother changing clothes after he clocked out. The grease was on his skin now. He drove to the trailer park and left the Chevy unlocked outside his family's home, since nobody was likely to steal it. He stood outside before entering and noticed that all the windows were dark except for one, which flickered with blue light as it always did. Once inside, he found his father sitting in front of the TV, watching some syndicated sitcom he had likely seen before. Connor murmured a greeting, left the Happy Meal toys on the kitchen table where Tommy would find them the next morning, and headed to the bathroom. Leaving the light off, he stripped out of his clothes and felt his way to the shower. As soon as the hot water coursed over his body, the smell of McDonald's washing down the drain, he pressed his forehead against the cool tile and sighed. Maybe tomorrow things would finally get better.
Chapter 3. David spent most of pre-calculus staring out the corner of his eye. He would occasionally pretend he was taking notes, scrawling doodles instead, but mostly he remained on high alert in case Chuck decided to do something crazy. David used to feel safe in class, physically at least, but now the ante had been upped. He could feel the frustration radiating off his nemesis in angry waves. And yet, David was more relaxed today than normal. That had everything to do with seeing someone stand up to Chuck and get away with it, although he sure hoped Connor was serious about driving him home from now on. Better the devil you barely knew than the one who wanted to whoop your ass. The bell rang, startling him. Chuck, perhaps interpreting this as fear, chose that moment to address him.
"You're dead, fag."
He didn't mean that, did he? David wasn't sure if his life was at risk, but he wouldn't take any chances. He gathered up his things, delaying just long enough for the teacher to move toward the door. Last year, a student had brought a gun to school and flipped out after class, waving it around and screaming incoherently. The gun wasn't loaded, so he only managed to scare everyone. But since then, the school had adopted a new policy. Between classes, teachers were to stand outside their classrooms and monitor the hallways. David didn't see what use they would be against a loaded gun, but this meant he was mostly safe inside the building. Of course, people could still push or trip him, and sometimes they did, but no one could beat him up. He waited until Chuck was out of sight before walking to his computer science class. Nobody bothered him during this period, but he often spent it worrying about what would happen after school. His stomach would churn in fear as he entertained unrealistic fantasies, like gaining the ability to teleport home safely. Today he thought about Connor instead. He wondered again if this was all some sort of intricate plan to break him down, but the more he reviewed the events of the past few days, the less he thought so. Chuck didn't possess that much tact, and Connor... David wasn't sure what to think about him. Had the mistakes of his past isolated Connor and made him desperate for a friend? They would make an odd pair, the guy who had done terrible things and the guy who hadn't done much of anything at all. By the time sixth period was over, David found himself eager to discover how the afternoon would play out. He even forgot to be on guard until he saw Chuck standing by the entrance, surrounded by his goons. David hesitated before he forced himself to keep walking. If he stayed with the flow of the crowd, maybe he could slip outside unnoticed and make a break for Connor's beat-up old car. He had just reached the glass doors when Chuck noticed him, his eyes lighting up as a vicious smile slowly unfurled. He was too far away to be an immediate threat, so David pressed against the door, deciding he really would run. Except the door didn't budge. He looked through the glass panel in confusion and saw the guy with the long, grungy hair, who sneered and then turned his head. David followed his gaze and saw Chuck shoving his way through the crowd. If he was quick, David could dart deeper into the school instead, find a teacher, and an arm wrapped around Chuck's neck like a shepherd's crook. Connor had appeared from behind him, a lit cigarette dangling from one corner of his mouth. He was smoking inside the building. He really was crazy. Chuck's eyes were bulging as Connor exhaled sideways, blowing a gray haze into his face. "Hey, kiddo," Connor said, nodding upward as he addressed David. His smile was amiable, his stare slightly unfocused and more than a little unhinged. "Ready to go?" "What the hell?" Chuck managed to croak out. "Is he paying you or something?" The smile fell from Connor's face, leaving it grim as a graveyard. "Are you calling me a whore?" "No!" Chuck pulled away from him. "That's not what I meant." "Good." Connor gave him what appeared to be a friendly punch on the arm, but it made Chuck wince. Then he held out his half-smoked cigarette. "Here, hold this for me real quick." Chuck took it, probably to stop it from coming any closer to his face. Connor motioned to David that they should leave. About 5 seconds later, a teacher noticed Chuck holding the cigarette and came over to lecture him. "Thank you," David said. Had he said that yet? Until now, he wasn't sure if Connor was doing him a favor, but his timing couldn't have been a coincidence. He must have been hanging out by the doors, just in case David needed rescuing. "My pleasure," Connor said with a grin. He had a slight underbite, making his chin jut out. This made him resemble a pit bull, especially when he smiled. "You all right?" he asked when he noticed David staring. "Yeah," he forced himself to look away. "I was just thinking that maybe I should pay you." "Now you were calling me a whore?" David risked a laugh, hoping he had interpreted the humor correctly, and felt relieved when Connor joined in. "Not a whore, more like a bodyguard." "I like the sound of that. Hey, I should wear shades and always have my finger pressed to my ear, like I'm in the Secret Service." "That would be cool, especially if the earpiece was real. David would love to have someone he could call on whenever he was in trouble." "I've got the job, then?" David laughed, thinking it was another joke, except this time Connor seemed serious. Was that his motivation? Money? If so, it answered the biggest question running through his mind. Why all the heroics? They didn't know each other. David had come up with a number of theories to explain his behavior. Connor might have some sort of rivalry with Chuck and enjoyed interfering with his plans, no matter who the intended victim was. Or maybe he was atoning for past sins, trying to earn good karma to offset the terrible things he had done. Money made the world go round, so it could be as simple as that. "I'm broke," David admitted. "I can't afford to pay you anything." "You can pay me back when you're rich someday," Connor said, leading the way across the parking lot. "What makes you think I will be?" Connor glanced over at him and shrugged. "You seem like a smart guy. I bet you read a lot." "I guess so," David said. Aside from being that gay guy, he had never tried to imagine how other people perceived him. Coming across as brainy wasn't bad, unless that was a polite way of calling him a nerd. But he'd take that too. Anything was better than being a bully like Chuck. "Are we picking up Tommy again?" They had reached the car, David glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't about to be jumped. Chuck and his friends were nowhere to be seen. "Yup, door's unlocked. Nobody wants to steal this thing, believe me." David climbed into the car, taking a closer look than he had the day before. The interior was messy, especially the floor and back, which was covered in crumpled-up cigarette packages and empty McDonald's cups. That didn't tell him much about Connor, aside that he wasn't very tidy. If they were going to carpool every day, David wanted to learn more about him. "What do you usually do on weekends?" he asked as they pulled out of the parking lot. "When I'm not working, just hang out. Same stuff everyone else does. You?" "I like to play video games with Gordon. You know, the guy you saw yesterday? He's my best friend. When I'm not with him, I read or listen to music. Sometimes my dad tries to get me to do thrilling things around the house, like dusting shelves or scrubbing the toilets, but I keep telling him I have a weak heart that can't stand the excitement." "Same here," Connor said with a chuckle, but he didn't offer any more information about himself. They pulled into the grade school parking lot, Tommy pounding down the sidewalk and looking pleased to see him again. He climbed over David to reach the back instead of waiting for him to get out, and wedged himself between the front seats so he could address them. "See my new transformer?" He held it up for David to examine. It was small and cheap, like a fast food toy, and resembled the yellow car from the movie. "You can try it," Tommy said, shoving it into his hands. David took the toy, switching it back and forth between robot and vehicle mode in a few easy steps. "I used to have some of these," he said, handing it back. "Might still have some of them boxed up somewhere." Tommy's mouth became an O as his face stretched out, reminding David of the famous painting by Edvard Munch. He could still remember when toys were his biggest priority. He'd have to dig through his old stuff to see if he could find them. "My brother gave me this one," Tommy said. "I have a ton of Happy Meal toys. I've got them all, actually." "They've been making them since the Stone Age," Connor said, shaking his head. "So you definitely don't have them all." "But I have a bunch," Tommy said. "That is true," his brother confirmed. "Do you eat there a lot?" David asked. Connor scoffed. "Are you crazy? No, I just work there." "Oh." "I really do have most of them," Tommy insisted. "You should come see all my toys." Connor turned to David, his green eyes intense, although in a different way now. "Could be fun." "You mean right now?" "Yeah, I don't have to work tonight." "Oh, okay." Tommy cheered. David forced a smile, having no idea what to expect. He had wanted to learn more about Connor, and for better or worse, that wish was about to come true. The trailer park was on the west side of town. David hadn't known that such a thing existed. The city of Olathe was part of the wealthiest county in Kansas, but that wasn't immediately obvious, since many of the homes that were built in the 60s and 70s now looked dated. The smaller houses of the old downtown area had fared better, the architecture timeless, even though most people considered the neighborhood to be undesirable. Connor lived north of this, which was puzzling, because the poorly lit trailer park they pulled into wasn't anywhere near the school they attended. There were other high schools much closer to his home. "I'm surprised you don't go to Olathe North," David said. "Isn't it just down the road?" "Yeah." Connor cleared his throat and slowed down for one of the trailer park's speed bumps. "Mom thought Olathe South was a better school, and, I was having a hard time. She thought the change would help." In other words, he had tried to escape his reputation by switching schools, but that obviously hadn't worked. David looked out the window at the trailers, each different. Some were wide and resembled a rectangular house, while others appeared to be hammered together out of old siding. The one Connor pulled up to was somewhere in between. It wasn't a double wide, but both the trailer and its tiny strip of yard seemed fairly well maintained. David continued to look around after he exited the vehicle. Tommy brushed past him and dashed inside, the trailer door slamming shut. Connor shook his head at this. "At least that will wake up Dad." The same man he had attempted to kill? David felt apprehensive as they went inside. The interior of the trailer was dark and cool, a welcome break from the heat outside. They were standing in an open space, a living room spread out to the right, a small kitchen and dining area to the left. What struck him most were the decorations, such as the wooden heart hanging on the wall with the hand-painted phrase, "Bless our family in this home." Little touches like these made David yearn to have his mom around again, because his father was not the sort of man to bother with anything so frivolous. The sound of a studio audience drew his attention to the living room, where a pair of recliners faced a television. A woman on the screen was in the middle of a foul-mouthed rant, her voice rising to be heard over the booing. Just another cheap daytime talk show that thrived on sensationalism. David noticed that one of the recliners was occupied, a hairy arm resting on an adjoining table cluttered with prescription medicine bottles.
Connor led him around to the front of the chairs, where an overweight, balding man sat. He struggled to see any family resemblance. The man might have had a stronger build once, like his son, and maybe the light brown hair, what remained of it anyway, used to shimmer with gold during the summer, but it appeared as though he hadn't seen much of the sun lately. The man's skin was pasty and pale, his drooping jowls covered in stubble. He seemed irritated that they were standing in front of the television, blocking his view. "Dad," Connor said, "this is my friend David. David, this is my dad, Stephen." "Hi," David said. "It's nice to meet you." "How's it going?" Stephen muttered, before he leaned to the side so he could see the screen better. Connor huffed and shook his head. "Forget it. Let's go in my room before Tommy has a heart attack." Down a short hallway there were 2 doors, only one of them open. Tommy was inside, slowly scooping the contents of a toy box out onto the floor. The decor was schizophrenic. One side were the trappings of a child, toys, Pixar posters, and a little desk cluttered with loose crayons and an old laptop. The other half of the room was more mature. A dresser nearly exploded with clothes. On it was a stereo that still played cassettes and CDs. A couple of posters hung on the walls. One showed a pickup truck rolling over a rocky terrain. Judging from the crease where it had been folded, it had probably come out of a magazine or brochure. In the other poster, a shirtless Jim Morrison spread his arms wide, his expression pouty. David tore his eyes away from this and noticed the 2 twin-sized beds shoved against opposite walls, confirming that Tommy and Connor shared this room. "Told you I had a lot," Tommy said. "You're making a mess," Connor complained, stuffing some of the clothes back into the dresser drawers. "Sorry, it's always like this." "Look at this one!" A plastic dinosaur with light-up eyes was shoved in David's face. For the next 10 minutes he was subjected to a year's worth of show-and-tell presentations. "Tommy," Connor said finally, "why don't you take the new Transformers you got over to Richie's place? Most of those aren't supposed to be released until later this month. I bet he'll be excited to see them." Tommy agreed. He gathered up the toys in question and left the room, the trailer's front door slamming shut after him. "Let the neighbors deal with him," Connor said as he bent to put the toys away. David was soon on his knees, helping shovel countless fast food premiums back into the toy chest. He was close enough to Connor that their shoulders bumped a few times. The faint aroma of cigarettes radiated off him, a scent David normally didn't enjoy, but somehow it smelled especially masculine on Connor, almost like a rugged cologne. Once they were finished tidying up, Connor sat on his bed and gestured for David to take a seat on Tommy's. "Not the most luxurious accommodations," he said. David smiled. "It's fine, really." "So you're a junior, right?" "Yeah." Could he tell just by looking at him? Or Eddie asked around. "And you're still a senior?" He wished he would have phrased it different, because Connor clenched his jaw before answering, "Yeah, I'm still a senior. I guess you've heard that I was held back a year. Not by choice, believe me. Just a couple more weeks until I'm done with high school forever." David's eyes dropped to the scar on Connor's neck. He averted them immediately, but it was too late. Connor had noticed. "Look, if you want to know, just ask. It's not a secret." "Sorry," David said. "How much of it is true?" "The stupid crap they say about me?" Connor leaned his head against the wall, rolling it back and forth like he was about to deny it all. Then he exhaled. "My dad used to work in a factory. Really early shifts, which meant he would drink sooner than most people. You know what I mean? Noon was like night for him because that's when he got off work, and a lot of people drink when they're off work, so..." "My dad does," David said, wanting to make him feel better. "Wine, mostly." "Does he get drunk?" David thought about it. "I don't know. A little buzzed, maybe. It's hard to tell. My dad is very in control of himself." "Huh. My dad also handles it well. Or used to. He doesn't drink anymore. Even when he did, he wasn't loud or abusive.
He just liked to unwind. Anyway, one day after school, we were out of everything and I was starving, so I talked him into bringing me to the store.
Wait, he drove you there while he was drunk?
Connor nodded, his expression defensive. We all make mistakes, and really what happened wasn't his fault. We were going through a four-way stop on Ridgeview Road, up where it gets narrow and hilly. He did everything right. He stopped like he was supposed to, and when we pulled out into the intersection, some guy went barreling through and slammed right into us, hard enough that we spun into a ditch and rolled.
The whole car?
Yeah. Connor absent-mindedly rubbed the scar on his neck. My dad got the worst of it. The other driver hit his side of the car and messed him up pretty bad. I did okay, except for the shrapnel.
David didn't hide his confusion. Shrapnel? Like what? Broken glass from the windshield?
No, that was cracked, but it stayed in one piece. Our car was an old Plymouth Roadrunner, and I guess the plastic dashboard got pretty brittle over the years, since part of it shattered on impact. A shard went through my neck, but by some miracle it didn't sever an artery. I got some other nicks, too. Want to see?
David nodded. Connor stood and pulled up his shirt, revealing a stomach that had just enough definition to hint at the muscles beneath. The strong chest covered in fine blonde hair wasn't as subtle. David stared at it hungrily before remembering what he was supposed to be looking at and sought out more pink scars, which he found by the left shoulder. He tried to focus on these, feeling guilty for finding Connor's body so attractive when such a painful story was being told.
That must have really hurt, David said, when Connor dropped his shirt again. Most of it's a blur. I was in the hospital for a few days, Dad for way longer than that. He came out with a couple of pins in his arms and a jacked-up back. He never really recovered from it.
Connor turned away, digging through a nightstand drawer while he talked.
Mom flipped out, of course. Even once my cuts had healed, she still kept me home. I think she was scared that something else might happen to me. Dad was doing jail time. The doctors noticed the alcohol level of his blood, and I guess they're legally required to report it to the police. Anyway, my mom still had to work, and she didn't have anyone else to rely on. Tommy was really little then, and my sister was going through a wild phase, so everything was a mess.
Connor found a small box, set it on the nightstand, and closed the drawer.
Long story short, I missed too much school and had to repeat 8th grade.
That sucks. These words, the only ones David could think to say, felt wholly inadequate, especially when he tried to imagine how the rumors at school must have made him feel, if Connor knew them at all. He probably did. The mean things people said about David sure had a way of working their way back to him. I guess you already know what people say about you? Like how you got that scar?
Connor smirked. I've heard a few versions. I used to be a gangbanger, right? When I tried to quit, they slit my throat and left me for dead.
I heard you got it behind bars. Connor laughed at this. He didn't seem to care, but it bothered David now that he knew the truth. Where did all that come from? He asked. Who would make up a story like that?
Connor shrugged. Why do people say things about you that aren't true?
Except in David's case, the rumors were reality. He was gay, although he wondered how many people realized that, and how many were merely trying to insult him in the least creative way possible. No matter how ill their intent, at least they weren't spreading lies.
People like to believe whatever makes them feel superior, Connor said. You can't let it get to you.
He opened the little wooden box and pulled out a small white stick.
Want to smoke a joint with me?
David's eyes widened. Then he snorted. You almost had me believing that you're a saint.
Connor shrugged. Nobody slit my throat, but I've always been a little crazy. Here, you can get us started.
David accepted the joint and held it by one of the twisted ends while trying to light the other side. He held it away from himself while doing so, as if it were a firecracker about to go off. He noticed Connor looking puzzled and lowered the lighter.
I have no idea what I'm doing, he admitted. I've never even smoked a cigarette.
Seriously?
Connor blinked and shook away his surprise.
That's okay. Give it back and I'll show you how it's done. I mean, if you want to. It's your choice.
David nodded eagerly. All those anti-drug commercials had accomplished one thing. They had made him curious. What about your dad?
He doesn't care. Did you see the mountain of pills they have him on? He's higher than we'll ever be. Tommy is the only one we have to worry about. I don't want him seeing this.
Connor stood, locked the door, and cracked a window, the joint hanging from his lips the entire time. He sparked it up and winked at David as he took a deep drag. Then he held his breath, holding it in before he exhaled a thick cloud of smoke.
See? Nothing to it.
He offered the joint to David, who took it. The paper was wet where Connor's lips had been. This thought was still on his mind when David pulled on the joint. A split second later, he was coughing and desperately trying to get fresh air into his lungs.
It's all good. Connor forced away a smile. Totally normal for your first time. Did you manage to inhale much?
I have no idea, he wheezed in response. Connor took another drag while David recovered, then handed it to him again.
Nice and slow this time.
David tried his best, but still ended up coughing.
You have to inhale or all your suffering will be for nothing. Be right back. I'll get you something to drink.
Connor returned with a generic can of soda, fresh from the fridge. The cold liquid felt heavenly on David's throat, but he didn't think he could handle smoking more.
Let's try this.
Connor sat on the bed next to him.
You're familiar with shotgunning, right? No? I'll take a drag without inhaling and blow it into your mouth. Just breathe in like you always do. You'll get a good mix of air with the smoke and it'll go down easier.
The concept sounded silly, but as Connor took a drag and leaned closer to David, he found he liked the suggestion after all. Connor's lips were mere inches away when he started to blow. David inhaled, staring into those emerald irises before he felt his cheeks burn. He looked away, afraid of what his own gaze might reveal.
Nicely done, Connor said. Hold it in as long as you can.
David did, and when he exhaled, smoke floated on the air. Connor grinned at him and repeated the process, twice. David was sure that Connor's lips were coming closer each time, and something big was about to happen, if only by accident, and he realized just how much he wanted that. Connor leaned away and took a couple of drags for himself before stubbing out the remainder in an ashtray. When he turned on the stereo, David felt as though he was hearing music for the first time. The difference was like living in a monochrome world and one day stumbling out into magical land made of color. Had the tornado that swept Dorothy Gale away to Oz been made of smoke? If so, David felt like he wasn't far behind her. He almost cried out in protest when Connor lowered the volume, but what came next was even better. They talked. The subjects didn't matter because everything they said felt important. Each thought carried tremendous weight, and no matter what David said or how jumbled his words were, Connor seemed to be right there with him, understanding exactly what he meant. David hoped it wasn't just the drugs, that they really did have such an empathic connection. He liked Connor, especially now that he knew the truth. They should be friends, but before that could happen, David had a confession of his own. He didn't know how well it would go over. He had only come out to his parents and Gordon before, and they had the benefit of knowing him for years beforehand. Then again, Connor understood how it felt to be an outsider. Surely that would make him more tolerant, right? Better to find out now than later. Connor? Hey! The doorknob rattled, followed by a knock and Tommy's complaining tones. Dad wants to know when you're going to cook dinner. Dinner? The electric numbers of the nightstand clock were just a few digits shy of 7. His father would already be home and putting dinner on the table. And what about Gordon? David pictured him still waiting on the front steps, morosely flipping through a strategy guide. I have to go home.
No problem, Connor said. I need to whip up something for the brat to eat anyway.
Okay.
David stood. Part of him didn't want to leave.
This was really fun.
Connor grinned. I liked it too.
What about tomorrow?
Don't even worry about it. I'm your bodyguard now, remember? I won't let anyone else mess with you.
That isn't what he meant. David wanted to do this again, but he couldn't invite himself over. Instead, he followed Connor outside to his car and quickly discovered that he didn't enjoy the world outside the trailer. As mellow as his buzz had been inside, suddenly he felt conspicuous, like everyone they passed, even in traffic, was staring at him and aware that he was high. David wasn't a good conversation partner during the ride, and when it came time to say goodbye, he struggled to find words that sounded normal.
Doing okay? Connor asked.
I think I'm freaking out, David admitted.
Connor laughed. That's totally normal. You'll be fine. Just get inside and eat. That'll give your head something to sing about. I'll see you tomorrow.
He was right. Being inside did help, but being high around his father was another level of weirdness entirely. When he got the first bite of pasta in his mouth, all was forgotten. How could he have ever tired of this meal? It was a gourmet masterpiece. This is really, really good, Dad. Richard seemed surprised, but pleased.
It's the same as it always is, although I did use more oregano than usual.
His father had been waiting for him, already enjoying a glass of wine, which always helped to take the edge off.
Tell me more about this new friend of yours. Does he do well in school?
David snorted. No idea. I never compare report cards on a first date.
Is that what this was? You were on a date?
He had only meant it as a joke, but now it had been twisted into another prying question. Although this might be the first time his father had asked about his personal life. When David first came out to him, Richard had reacted to the news with about as much interest as if he'd reported a sore throat. David could probably claim to be a serial killer and his father wouldn't care, as long as he got good grades. He's straight, David said. We're just friends.
That's for the best. You don't want to get distracted before you retake your SATs next semester. I know you can get a better score. You have the potential to be in the top percentile.
At least they were back in familiar territory. When dinner was finished and the dishes were clean, David went to his room and turned on some music. It didn't sound quite as mind-blowing as it had a few hours ago. The high was fading. But when he thought of Connor, the feelings were just as strong, if not stronger. Those hadn't been drug-induced. David thought back on the afternoon, to his favorite part in particular. He would happily shotgun carbon monoxide just to get near those lips again. Chapter 4.
Connor fumbled with the cardboard lid of the cigarette box, repeatedly flipping it open and shut. He'd gone almost an entire day without smoking. Maybe he was being stupid. David said he didn't like the smell of cigarettes, but so what? He usually wasn't around when Connor smoked, so it shouldn't matter. And yet, somehow it did. Mr. Wesley, his English teacher, was giving him the eye, so Connor pocketed the cigarettes and stared at the clock until the bell finally rang. The entire class came to life, shuffling their belongings and getting ready to leave. Mr. Wesley cleared his throat, a chorus of groans responding in anticipation, because he always did this. Be it a power play or just plain cruelty, Mr. Wesley would often make them stay behind an extra minute or two, if only to reiterate the details of their assignment or remind them of an upcoming test. He was merciless, even on a Friday like today. It was sixth period. They should riot, trampling the old geezer on the way out the door. After droning on with the urgency of a turtle, Mr. Wesley gave a benevolent wave, signifying they could leave. Connor did some mental calculation as he pushed his way through the halls, hoping he could still get to the parking lot ahead of David. Summer weather had made an early appearance, the sun unchallenged in an empty blue sky.
People chatted happily to each other, the weekend vibe already working its magic and putting everyone in a forgiving mood. Well, mostly everyone. Connor noticed that Chuck had parked directly next to his car. This had to be another ploy to mess with David. Not quite. As he got closer, the SUV's engine revved. Chuck was peering out at him from a barely lowered window. That's when Connor noticed the state of his own car. Beige paint trickled down the windshield, ran along the hood, and dripped on the parking lot. An upturned bucket sat atop the car, paint pouring in all directions. People wanted him to be a murdering psychopath? Fine. Connor was ready to make the rumors come true. He ran toward the SUV. Chuck slammed down on the gas pedal as he always did, swerving recklessly through the parking lot. He only braked once, just long enough to yell out his window, "Hey, Williams, about time you painted your car." Connor grabbed the empty bucket and threw it after him in a futile act of fury. When had Chuck gotten so gutsy? Connor had seen him pick on easy targets for years. Usually just name-calling and intimidation, bully basics. David Henry was the one exception. Chuck seemed to have a personal grudge against him, for whatever reason. He shouldn't have pushed his luck. Chuck had just kicked a hornet's nest. Now he was going to get stung. What happened? David's arrival did little to soothe Connor's temper. Chuck grew a pair, that's what. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have dragged you into this. Connor turned and saw the guilty expression, some of his anger melting away. This isn't your fault. Chuck was an asshole before either of us came along. He imagined the bucket of paint being dumped over David's head and decided the car didn't matter as much. At least he had managed to redirect Chuck's abuse. Connor could bear it. He was used to everyone hating him. Connor dug the keys from his pocket with a sigh and went to the trunk. He found some old towels from the last time he had changed the oil. If he was quick, he could get the windshield clean enough to see through so he could drive. As it turned out, all the towels did was smear the paint around. What about the windshield wiper fluid? David asked. He already had paint on his fingers, smudges of it marring his green hoodie. Connor clenched his teeth. There would be a reckoning. It's a dumb idea, David said, withering beneath his anger. No, it's not. Go ahead. David hopped into the driver's seat and pulled on the lever. They watched as fluid sprayed out and the wipers sent diluted paint flying, but this only seemed to make a bigger mess. Connor wiped with the towels between each spray, and eventually they managed to clear a spot on the driver's side that was milky instead of opaque. There's no way I'm making it to work tonight. Connor took the cell phone from his pocket, the edges wrapped in tape to hold the casing together, and dialed McDonald's. A day shift manager he barely knew took his message, which was better than talking to Mike. Maybe we should go to a car wash, David said. There's a do-it-yourself place up on Santa Fe. Think we can make it that far? Connor imagined the last $10 he had in his wallet disappearing in a puff of smoke. He had a paycheck waiting for him at work, but he'd have to actually show up to claim it. Okay, let's get Tommy first. He'll think this is funny. Hilarious was more like it. Tommy howled with laughter when he saw the car and kept snickering on the way to the car wash. Once there, he made a nuisance of himself, begging to use the pistol that shot streams of high-pressured water, but Connor wouldn't let him. He was too busy blasting off as much of the paint as possible. Only when he had done the best he could did he feed his last $2 into the coin slot and let Tommy have his fun. I want to kill him. The words took Connor by surprise. They echoed his own thoughts, but they were spoken by David, who was clenching his jaw. Maybe there was hope for him yet. This is how angry he should have been each time Chuck picked on him. Better late than never. We'll get back at him. Connor looked at his car. It might be a piece of shit, but it had granted him a lot of freedom, and he cared about the dumb thing. Yeah, we'll definitely make him cry for this. David kicked at a dried wad of chewing gum on the pavement. You don't have to be my bodyguard anymore. My whole life has been like this. I'm used to it. but I don't like seeing bad things happen to you."
Connor snorted. "You think I haven't been through this before? The guy who supposedly tried to murder his own father? I've been called every name you can imagine. You've just got to stand up for yourself. Jerks like Chuck only go after people they think are weaker than them." Tommy shouted as the water pressure nearly knocked him backward, bringing their attention back to the car, which never looked great, but now it was a real embarrassment. The gray primer was streaked with boring beige paint that had probably been designed to coat someone's living room walls, or maybe the exterior of a house, considering how water-resistant it was. "Okay," Connor conceded. "So maybe Chuck is more trouble than I expected. That's why we've got to stick together."
"I can't fight," David said. "I'm not even good at yelling. I get too flustered and the words won't come out right. I'm more of a liability to you than anything."
"I don't want you to help me jump him. That's not what I mean. Another pair of eyes would be useful to watch out for crap like this. You seem like a smart guy, too. I bet you can dream up some way we can make Chuck pay without getting us in trouble."
"Me?"
"Yes, you. I've got your back. You should have mine. How are we going to get even?"
"I'll think about it,"
David said, standing up a little straighter.
"Or we could go over to my place and start planning. If you want to, that is."
"Sounds good." The timer on the car wash had run out anyway, and Tommy was already searching for the next distraction. He liked the idea of going over to David's house. When they got there, the weird kid was sitting on the front steps again, scowling at them from behind his thick glasses, except this time he appeared to be genuinely angry rather than confused. David groaned.
"Oh man, I forgot to tell Gordon where I was yesterday."
"Is he going to make you sleep on the couch tonight?"
"He'll be mad at me, that's for sure."
As it turned out, Gordon's irritation was swiftly replaced by curiosity. This was obvious, since the kid wore most of his opinions on his face and spoke the rest out loud. Connor was okay with that. Direct people didn't bother with two-faced games, although they weren't exactly charming either.
"Your car is a piece of junk," Gordon said after David introduced them.
"Yeah," Connor nodded. "It is." Gordon stared at him before he turned to David.
"Where were you yesterday? I thought we were going to fight the Brotherhood of Dark Clerics together."
"Hey," Tommy said, grabbing the strategy guide from Gordon's hands.
"Is that a dragon death game?"
Connor was about to scold him for being rude, but Gordon seemed thrilled by his enthusiasm. Soon they were speaking in a language that sounded like English, even though most of the terms were complete nonsense to him. At least his little brother was preoccupied. David was, too, unlocking the front door and ushering them all inside while looking increasingly anxious. Connor wasn't sure why. The condo was nice enough. A stairwell in the entryway led up to another floor, but they remained on the ground level, entering a dining area that bled into a living room. A kitchen was off to one side, separated by a breakfast bar and a row of cabinets. Everything was much newer than what he had at home. No surprise there. With his dad's medical bills and a single breadwinner in the family, they were lucky to get by. While the furniture here was in nicer condition, the place lacked personality. David led them to the back of the condo, where a stairwell led downward, turning once before ending in a small family room. Aside from an old recliner and treadmill, the space was mostly used for storing boxes. David took them to one of the closed doors, which, when opened, revealed a welcoming burst of color. The walls were covered in posters and magazine ads. A large bed dominated most of the room, as did an entertainment center at the end of it, leaving a U-shaped patch of carpet around the edges. Gordon took a seat on the bed. Tommy plopped down next to him.
"That's where David sits,"
Gordon said disapprovingly.
"Maybe he can take over for me today,"
David suggested, handing Tommy a controller.
"You just have to promise to do what Gordon says. He won't steer you wrong."
"Okay, I promise." Tommy was thrilled with the idea. Gordon less so, but soon he adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud from the strategy guide. Something about a magical chalice and an army of orcs. Tommy seemed to get it, though. So did David. He sat next to them and seemed eager to make this new partnership work. Connor let them play, only occasionally glancing at the screen.
He was more interested in the posters and magazine ads on the wall. He was walking along it to get a better look when David noticed and leapt up. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Snooping," Connor said with a wink. "Oh, want to help me grab some drinks?" "Only if I get a guided tour along the way." "Really? It'll be boring. I'm supposed to be at work right now. By comparison, this is like being at a theme park." David laughed. "Then strap yourself in, because the first thrilling ride is up the stairs to the kitchen." Connor followed him there and checked out David's butt as he rummaged in the fridge. It had been way too long since he'd had any action. That was unlikely to change, so he had to take cheap thrills where they could be found. David stood again, holding up 4 cans and crinkling his nose at one of them. 3 regulars and a diet. Someone's going to have to drink it. Give it to Tommy. He doesn't need any more sugar." "Okay." David held out 2 of the cans for him to carry. Connor shook his head. "You promised me a tour." "I was hoping you had forgotten already." "Not a chance." David set the cans on the counter. "Let's get this over with. You've already experienced the kitchen. If you'll follow me this way to the living room, you'll see the big TV that I think should be in my room since my dad barely watches it. That's a couch. We use it for sitting. And, oh hey, back the way we came, you might notice a table. You'll never believe this, but we put food on it sometimes. Then we eat it." "The table?" Connor asked innocently. "Exactly. The food always ends up on the floor, and we have to buy a new table every day. But it's a family tradition, and those are important to us." Connor grinned. "How about upstairs?" "That's not important or traditional, but I'll show you anyhow." David led him upstairs to a short hallway with 3 doors. Connor could see a bathroom counter beyond one. They turned right and entered a room dedicated to book-laden shelves, mostly nonfiction, judging from the subdued spines. A medium-sized desk and computer occupied the center of the room, and in one corner, near a standing lamp, was a lush leather chair, the trash can next to it filled with empty wine bottles. "This is my dad's office," David explained. "What's he do?" "He's a professor at the University of Missouri, the Kansas City campus anyway." "So he's a smart guy then?" "Yeah." Connor nodded to the trash can. "And he likes to party." David looked uncomfortable. "At night, he comes up here, puts on classical music, and just sits there sipping wine. It's the one thing we have in common. The music, not the drinking. Sometimes that's all I do at night. I love listening to music." "While lying in bed?" Connor pictured him stretched out on his back and staring at the ceiling, the green hoodie pulling away from the line of his jeans, revealing a hint of flat, smooth stomach. Ugh, it had definitely been way too long. "Take a photo if you want," David said, bringing him back to the present. "Or you can purchase a special Dad's Office magnet from the gift shop at the end of the tour." Connor pulled out his phone and took a photo, but he made sure to take a step back so that David was in the frame. In fact, he moved the camera at the last second to focus mostly on him. Connor would look at it later tonight. Cheap thrills. "This way, sir," David was saying as he led the way across the hall. "You won't want to miss the grand finale. People travel from miles around just to see it. Ah, here it is. I present to you the bedroom of a middle-aged man." Despite the sarcasm, the final room really did interest him, since it revealed a lot about their family life. The no-frills bed was neatly made. The lack of decoration continued, aside from the family portrait on the wall. The dressers were clear of anything even remotely feminine. Mom didn't live here anymore. Despite the 3 smiling faces on the wall, Connor didn't think she had for quite some time. He moved closer to consider the portrait. David stood between his parents at an embarrassingly juvenile age. His face was chubby and framed by a brown clown wig. Connor had to glance over at the modern version to verify how much had changed. Height had stretched the chubbiness out of David's features. His hair was now shorter on top and cropped close on the sides, and while it was still a little bouffant, Connor found himself wanting to run his fingers through it. "I look horrible, I know," David said. "I never want to be 12 again." Connor returned his attention to the portrait. David had improved in every way except one. The brown eyes of his 12-year-old self were glassy with joy. The David of today had eyes that were sad when not guarded. The two adults to either side of him made an odd pair. The father shared David's lanky, broad-shouldered build. The rest of his features were hidden behind glasses and a beard. His appearance was stern, the pressed suit drab and serious, but Connor found this appealing compared to what his own father had become. The mother, by comparison, dressed in bright colors and snazzy jewelry, blonde highlights filling her long curly hair. Her smile was open-mouthed, giving her a slightly surprised appearance. "She left him the year this was taken," David explained. "What happened?" David took a deep breath. "Mom said that she needed to find herself, whatever that means. She remarried less than a year later. I think she was seeing the new guy while she was still with my dad, but I've never asked." "And you decided to stay with him?" David nodded. "I didn't understand it all like I do now, but even then I knew my dad was the loser in the situation. I felt like someone should live with him, or else he would have been alone. That worked out well for me since Jeff, my mom's new husband, is a real jerk." "I can't imagine what that must be like," Connor said, "having to choose." David nodded. "The worst part is how everything changed. I used to think that my parents were flawless. They've been taking care of me my entire life, so I felt like they had all the answers. When they got divorced, the veil was lifted. I see them now as real people, flaws and all, and I try to tell myself that it's better this way. But I miss it sometimes." "Miss what?" "The way I used to see the world. Everything made more sense to me back then, even if I was deluded." Connor took a deep breath. Then he exhaled. "I get it." David looked over at him sharply. "I thought your parents were still together." "They are, but after the accident, Dad wasn't the same. I had to step up in a lot of ways because of that. I used to think my parents could handle anything, almost like they were gods. They seem that way when you're small, you know, like they're all-powerful. Now I watch my mom wear herself out trying to pay the bills, and I'm constantly reminded that she's only human. Which is more than I can say for my dad. I don't know what he is anymore." "Is he okay?" David asked. "He didn't say much when I was there." Connor nodded. "All those painkillers he's on, they mess with his head." "Oh, I'm really sorry." Connor nudged him, wanting to lighten the mood. "It's all good. Who doesn't have a fucked-up family these days, right?" "Yeah." As they left the room, Connor glanced back at the family portrait once more, at the cherub face in the center, and wished he could make David feel safe again. Maybe then his eyes would light up the way they used to. The atmosphere in the basement bedroom was thick when they returned. The television was blasting out a guitar riff with a heavy bass beat. Gordon was on his feet, head whipping between his book and the screen as he read and reread paragraphs to Tommy. "Holy shit, is that the Dragon Lord?" David said, rushing to join them. Gordon nodded grimly. "I didn't expect to find him this early in the game." "Don't worry," Tommy said. "I'm kicking his butt." Connor shook his head ruefully, feeling like the only mature one in the room as he sipped from his can of soda. David stared slack-jawed at the screen, his full attention on the game, which made it easy to check him out. Connor felt something stir inside him. This wasn't good. His intentions had been noble enough at the beginning. He never liked to see an underdog take a beating, especially not by an asshole like Chuck, so Connor had stood up for David. But those protective urges were quickly turning into a different kind. Oh well. He welcomed such feelings, felt high on them, even though he knew they would turn to frustration and maybe even pain. Eventually, he would pay the price of protecting David. Not dumb stuff like the car getting covered in paint. That didn't matter so much to him. Rejection and the dream of what would never be, that's what would keep him up at night. The battle with the Dragon Lord raged on, so Connor examined the images on David's walls. Most were of faraway locations,
Beaches, mountains, deserts, and even underwater scenes. Mixed among these were advertisements for a variety of bands and video games, fashion labels too, which Connor found the most interesting, since many of them featured hot guys, like the black dude walking alongside a panther. Or the two shirtless men with their arms around each other. Connor stared at this. The homoerotic imagery was typical of college boy brands like Abercrombie and Fitch, but here it really stood out. He took a step back to reassess the themes on the wall. Faraway places, nerdy stuff, music, and guys. Some of the rock stars and rappers were women, but when it came to the eye candy, both stylishly dressed and scantily clad, men dominated the wall. A victorious roar came from the gamers, making him turn. David was grinning and patting Tommy on the back, but when he saw where Connor was standing, he leapt to his feet, just like he had before. "I have way too much stuff up there," David said dismissively. He seemed nervous. "I like it." Connor turned back to the images. "Have you been to many of these places?" "Huh? No, I wish." David considered the pictures, still tense. "I'd love to get out of Kansas. Go anywhere, see anything. Just get away from here." "Yeah, you and me both. Hey, we like a lot of the same bands. I didn't peg you for an Outcast fan." David nodded. "I like anything weird. Andre 3000 is a freak, and he's really—" Connor turned to him. "What?" "Talented." He was certain that wasn't how David had intended to end that sentence. "And these?" Connor pointed to a runway model with glossy pink lips, the same color as the nipples on his exposed chest. "Dreaming of a career on the catwalk? Or maybe you want to be a fashion designer?" David's cheeks flushed. "I just like the image. I didn't put that much thought into these. I figured anything was better than blank walls." "Uh-huh." Connor moved his finger down to the guys with their arms around each other. "What about this one?" A knock on the door made them both jump. When it swung open, the man Connor had seen in the family portrait was standing there, his beard streaked with gray now, his hair thinner. Otherwise, he looked the same, right down to the starchy clothing. The suit jacket was missing, but the buttoned-up shirt and tie could have been identical to those in the portrait. "You're home early," David said. "I informed you yesterday that I would be," Mr. Henry replied, attention moving from person to person and settling on Tommy. "Who do we have here?" David made the introductions and explained why someone so young was with them. Connor stood up straight and made sure his handshake was firm, hoping to make a good impression. Mr. Henry eyed him a moment before turning to his son. "I have some errands to run. I'd like you to come with me." "Oh, okay. I'll be up in just a few minutes." There was some fuss over saving the game that Connor ignored. Instead, he wished he could turn back the clock and continue the interrupted conversation. He was sure he hadn't imagined it, positive that he hadn't misunderstood. Now wasn't the time, though. David walked them outside. Gordon simply said, "Bye," before tromping down the sidewalk to wherever he lived. Tommy climbed into the car, buckling himself into the passenger seat. He left the door open. Connor closed it to give them privacy. "Sorry about your car," David said, scowling at the beige swirls of paint. Anger suited him. Sure, he still looked cute and mostly harmless even when glaring, but Connor wanted him to embrace that inner strength. Maybe not too soon. It felt good to be needed. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Chuck has a much nicer car and a lot more to lose." "Any idea where he lives?" "No. His dad has an office over on 151st Street. He's a dentist." David winced. "I forgot we were supposed to be plotting our revenge." "I'll figure something out." Tommy whined about wanting to leave and tried opening the car door, but Connor was quicker and pushed it shut again. He leaned against the door so it would stay that way. "I had fun hanging out with you." "Me too," David said. "Sorry I got pulled into the game." "It's fine. I had some things I was trying to figure out anyway." "Like what?" "You, mostly," Connor said. "I almost got there, too. Maybe next time."
He winked and walked around to the other side of the car. David looked confused or worried. Either way, Connor enjoyed being enigmatic. "See you around," he said. "Yeah," David replied. "I'll see you after school." "On Monday?" The flame in Connor's chest flickered and almost went out. Never had he hated a weekend so much. 2 entire days without getting to see David? That wouldn't do. Not at all. Chapter 5. David tossed aside the paperback and sighed. His concentration sucked right now anyway. He was sick of reading the same lines over and over. He reached for his phone, intending to look at porn, when an alternative occurred to him. David got up and went to his bookshelf. At the end of a row of worn paperbacks was a handful of yearbooks. He selected the most recent and returned to bed, sitting cross-legged with the book open in his lap as he flipped through the pages. David had been a sophomore last year, so most faces in the junior section weren't familiar to him. With one major exception, Connor Williams. His hair was longer in the photo instead of the buzz cut he had now, but he still looked older than everyone else in his class. Connor wasn't smiling. His expression was neutral, his stare vacant. The crazed energy that had been evident when he first intervened on David's behalf was absent. Mere days had passed since that event, but already he seemed completely different from the monster David had once imagined. Now he seemed lonely, isolated. David felt that way sometimes too, but he had a best friend in Gordon. Connor seemed to only have his little brother. Not having any siblings, David wasn't sure how satisfying that would be. Either way, Connor deserved to have friends his own age, or at the very least a girlfriend, since he was both handsome and sweet in a way that was easy to overlook if one paid attention to the rumors alone. Even that scar of his was kind of hot. David was tracing it on the yearbook photo with a fingertip when a tapping sound startled him. He wasn't sure of the source until it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. He oriented on the sound. Someone was at his window. He couldn't see who since the blinds were closed. His first thought was Gordon. David imagined him clutching the strategy guide in his hands while desperate to share some new information he had discovered. Or what if it was Chuck, so tired of being denied that he was making a home visit to beat him up? Or it could be Connor. Had he come to hear the confession that had been on his lips earlier? David had almost told him when standing in front of his posters. The evidence was there. He was too proud to deny it. Connor had probably figured it out already. All that remained to be seen was his reaction. This thought put David in motion. He went to the window, peeked through the blinds, and saw a wide grin accompanied by crazy green eyes. David felt a heady mixture of carelessness and desire. He yanked on the cord to raise the blinds and slid open the window. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Connor beamed at him. "Just wanted to see what you're up to." David laughed. "You could have texted." "I don't have your number." "Oh, right." Connor pushed at the screen. "Help me get this off. Do you see little tabs on your side?" They worked together on the screen like a trust-building exercise, Connor describing what he should do and David trying to make sense of his instructions until the screen finally popped loose. Connor set it aside and waited, still crouched on the ground. "Aren't you coming in?" David asked. "Nope. You're coming out. Let's go for a walk." David blanched at his choice of words, wondering if it was meant as a slight or a light-hearted jab. Either way, he worried that Connor found it funny that he was gay. Not that it wasn't at times. David could laugh at himself. But he was mocked enough at school. He wanted another friend like Gordon who didn't treat him any different because of it. "We need to talk," David said, as he attempted to climb through the window. It was just high enough up to be awkward. He was part way out, but his legs couldn't find anything to push against to get him the rest of the way. Connor noticed him struggling and grabbed him under the armpits and pulled. Then they stood, cramped together in the narrow space between the exterior wall and a row of bushes. David slid the window mostly shut behind him and followed Connor around an air conditioning unit that was steadily sucking the heat out of the building. Pushing through a section of brush that was thinner than the rest, they stumbled into the street. Bad news or good news? Connor said, picking up a plastic bag off the ground. Which do you want to hear first? David had things he needed to say too, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he decided it could wait. The bad news first. Chuck only lives a few blocks away from you, which is gross. Consider moving. The good news, he dug in the plastic bag and pulled out a bottle of water, is that we're going to have some fun. Yippee, David said as he accepted the bottle. Please tell me this is actually vodka? You like to drink? No. At least I don't think so. I never did drugs until just the other day. You're a bad influence. Connor smirked. Damn right. It's only water, but drink up anyway. After digging out another bottle from the bag, Connor opened it and chugged nearly all of it. David stared at his thick neck, the Adam's apple bobbing up and down, before he did the same. How did you find out where Chuck lives? He asked as they began walking. The almighty internet, Connor answered. I looked up the dentist office you mentioned and got his dad's first name. There are a lot of people named Marsh in the white pages, but only one with the right initials. That gave me the address. I cruised by on my way here to make sure. Why aren't we driving now? Because we need stealth, and my car isn't exactly quiet. He took another swig, crushed the empty bottle, and put the cap back on. Drink up. Excitement stirred in David as he did so. What were they going to do? Toilet paper his house? Leave a bag of burning dog poop on the front porch? The plastic bag Connor had been carrying was now empty and stuffed into his back pocket, so whatever the plan was, it didn't involve any supplies. The condos fading into the distance, they crossed a busy street to a community of houses that boasted 3-car garages and the occasional boat parked on a trailer outside. David glanced up at a sky half obscured by clouds and felt a primal calling, like he had abandoned civilization and given himself over to the wild. He had never snuck out of his house in the middle of the night. The irony was, he could probably have walked out the front door with his father's permission, considering he was almost 17 and it was a Friday, but doing it this way gave him complete freedom. He wouldn't have to report what he had done the next day, or be back at a certain time. As far as his father was concerned, David was still safely tucked in bed, not running around with some guy he barely knew. And who barely knew him. I need to tell you something, David said. Shh. Connor put a finger to his lips as they rounded a corner. There it is. The house wasn't as impressive as its neighbors, only having a 2-car garage, but a hint of blue light between the planks of the privacy fence suggested a pool. Parked out front was Chuck's SUV. Despite the vehicle being unoccupied, David felt it had a sinister presence, an extension of its owner's malevolence. What are we going to do? David whispered as they crept toward it. Nothing much, but it'll give us something to smile about when we see him on Monday. You take the driver's side. How come? You'll see. The streetlights were spaced far enough apart that the driveway was in shadow, but David still felt exposed. He waited by the driver's side door while Connor stood on the passenger side and fumbled with something. He glanced down once before he looked up again and grinned at him. Then came the sound of trickling water. Wait, David said. Are you peeing on his car? Connor nodded shamelessly. Next time one of Chuck's friends opens the door, their hands will end up sticky. How about the driver? David glanced at the door handle. Why the hell not? After double-checking the street, he unzipped his pants, pulled out his business, and went to town. He had to step back to avoid getting splashed, his aim worse than normal due to his laughter, but he got more than enough on the handle to ensure Chuck's fingers would be coated with a stale, sticky souvenir. Connor came around the car once David was finished. Feel better? He did. And the next time he sat beside Chuck in math class and had to listen to his insults, David would take solace in having indirectly pissed on him. Except it wasn't enough to make up for what had been done to Connor's car. Even if they scraped the windshield clean, the body of the car would still be covered in splashes of beige paint. Some easily washable urine hardly made things even. Acting on impulse, David took a step back and kicked the SUV. He was hoping to dent it, but the exterior was tougher than he expected. All he managed to do was set off the alarm, an annoying looping siren filling the empty street. Shit! They both said this at the same time, and after looking at each other, they raced off in the direction they had come. Once they made it around the corner, Connor started laughing. David didn't. He was sure they would get caught and pumped his legs as fast as they would go. When a hand grabbed his arm, he yelped in fright before he saw it was only Connor, who pulled them to the side of a house that wasn't lit. And he was still cracking up. "Can't breathe," he wheezed before doubling over again. The alarm wailed for a second longer before it beeped and turned off. David strained to hear if anything was happening on the next street over, but there was nothing. Like most car owners, Chuck had probably glanced out the window while turning off the alarm and nothing more. "And people say I'm crazy." David chuckled nervously. "Sorry, seemed like a good idea." "No harm done. Just give me some warning next time." They stood together with their backs pressed against the house, making sure trouble wasn't following. When it seemed like they were in the clear, they made their way back toward David's home. "What are you doing this weekend?" Connor asked along the way. "Sunday is Gordon's birthday. I promised to take him shopping. He'll probably want to binge on video games the rest of the day." "Oh." Connor kicked a pine cone off the sidewalk. "I have to work Saturday, but only during the day. Maybe we can get together afterwards. Go for a drive or hang out at my place. Tommy usually stays at a friend's house on the weekends." Would that mean a sleepover? Or would they just hang out and go their separate ways at night? It had been so long since David had a friend other than Gordon that he didn't know what to expect. It didn't really matter. He was up for anything, as long as they were spending time together. "Yeah, okay. Just give me a call when you're off work." Connor pulled out his cell phone, which looked almost as beat up as his car. "What's your number?" David told him, struggling to remember since he hardly ever gave it out. If he didn't use it for a few online logins, he wouldn't have known it at all. "Cool," Connor said. "You should have a text with my number." They were standing at the back of the condos. David didn't want to part ways. He wanted to talk more, and at the very least make sure that Connor knew he was gay. His sexuality didn't define who he was, but it was still a part of his life, and he couldn't be friends with someone who didn't accept that aspect of him. He hoped that Connor's experience of being treated differently would make him sympathetic. If not, well, it would hurt, but that was a risk he would have to take. This didn't seem like the right place, though, especially since he was still jumpy each time a car drove by, expecting it to be a black SUV. "You better let me check," David said. "My phone acts weird sometimes. Want to come inside real quick?" Connor shrugged. "Sure." Climbing back into his room through the window felt like breaking into his own home, but everything was as he left it, so he didn't think his absence had been noticed. Unplugging his phone from the charger, David navigated to his text messages, seeing one from a number he didn't recognize. It read, "Hey, it's your personal bodyguard. Give me a call sometime." He liked that. David made sure to add Connor to his list of contacts, taking his sweet time while doing so, because this was the moment of truth. No more delays or interruptions. Confession time. Heart thudding in his chest, David spun around. Connor was standing not far away, holding the yearbook, still open to where David had left it. No doubt he was staring at a tiny image of himself. Thank goodness he was distracted, because David's entire face was burning. He watched as the yearbook was carefully shut and set back down on the bed. Connor looked up then, gaze intense, but those green eyes weren't crazy. This was something different. He moved closer to David, stood right in front of him and reached out, placing a hand on the back of his neck while staring into his eyes. At first, David couldn't concentrate. Too many worries muddling his thoughts, too many explanations desperate to burble forth as his body buzzed with panic. Then he recognized just how good it felt to have another man touch him in this way, because it was unmistakably intimate. David couldn't think of any reason two guys would be this close, except for one, and that's when he realized that Connor was seeking permission. David answered him by taking a step forward, bringing their bodies close together. Connor smiled. "So I was right about you." "Yeah." David's breath was short. He felt like he was going to hyperventilate. "What about you?" Connor laughed. Then he responded by closing his eyes and pressing his lips against David's. He held them there long enough to prove that it wasn't a joke. Connor freaking Williams was gay, or at least curious enough for this to happen. David was about to tumble into those strong arms when the kiss ended. Connor had pulled back, expression insecure. "That's what you wanted, right?" David wasn't sure how to answer. "Is it what you wanted?" Connor chuckled. Yeah. I've been wanting to do that all day. But if you're not into me, I totally—" David moved forward, attempting to kiss him back, but his aim wasn't great. He didn't have any experience with this sort of thing. Thankfully, Connor seemed to know what he was doing. He adjusted, wrapping his arms around David and giving him more than a mere peck this time. David was pretty sure the tip of a tongue brushed against his lips, which felt super weird, but also kind of good. He struggled to find his voice. "So when you told Chuck that you're gay—" "I was just messing with him," Connor said. "I'm totally straight, obviously." David laughed. "Obviously? Seriously, though, are you bi or—" "I'm a shameless homosexual. You?" David smiled. "The same. I've been trying to tell you that all night." "Well," Connor said, nodding at the yearbook on the bed, "you managed to." David groaned. "I wasn't looking at your photo and doing anything weird." "That's more than I can say," Connor replied. "What do you mean?" "I took a photo of you earlier, during the tour." And you'll have to wait another day for that story." Connor turned as if intending to leave. "Wait," David cried in protest. "You can't go now." Connor hesitated, and for a moment he looked ready to pounce, but then he shook his head. "I might have been looking at your photo earlier, but that doesn't mean I finished. I don't trust myself right now." "I have no idea what you're talking about," David lied. "You'll have to be clearer than that." "Some other time. Besides, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. We're both stuck in Kansas, right?" David sighed wistfully. "Tell me about it." Connor winked. "I will. Tomorrow. See you then." Like a thief, he slipped out through the window and was gone. David listened until he heard the sound of an old engine rumbling away. Then he sat on the bed and waited, just in case Connor changed his mind, and tried to come to grips with what had happened. A guy had not only kissed David, but run off because he was too horny to be around him. He laughed at the absurdity of it and tried to imagine what life would be like from now on. He had always wanted this, but figured college would be his earliest opportunity, and that was an entire year away. 10 minutes later, David decided that Connor wasn't coming back. He closed the window, shut the blinds, and opened the yearbook again. Tomorrow couldn't come quickly enough, and as David unbuttoned his jeans, he decided that he couldn't either. Connor shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat on the way home, wishing his stupid erection would subside. He was tempted to whip it out and deal with it as he drove, but navigating with a paint-blurred windshield was dangerous enough. Besides, he wouldn't be surprised if he got pulled over, considering how terrible his car looked. So he turned his mind to a subject guaranteed to turn him off. His first time. He had been 16, younger than David probably, when he had first used a gay chat room. It had seemed less intimidating than an app. At first, Connor would only read the lewd comments and over-the-top usernames without contributing. His alias, Mr. Nobody 92, didn't exactly inspire people to private message him, but eventually someone did. Chatting openly about finding other guys attractive had been exhilarating at first. Connor had never done that before. His sexuality wasn't a secret, but he didn't have any friends to confide in, and talking about it with his family was too uncomfortable. Besides, his mother had enough to deal with, and his father never came down from his opiate-induced high, so Connor had poured his heart out to a complete stranger and felt, quite stupidly in retrospect, that he was in love before ever having seen the man. This was remedied less than a week later. He met Julian at a McDonald's, the very same one where he would end up working. trying to be smart by keeping their encounter public so nothing could go wrong. By the end of the meal, he agreed to go to a movie with Julian. The guy wasn't really his type. Julian was 23, which seemed old to him at the time. He had a light beard that Connor didn't like, but he did have a nice lanky frame. He couldn't remember a thing about the movie they saw. Julian had held his hand during it, stroking his arm and rubbing his thigh toward the end. The experience had been life-changing. Another man touching him, and Connor allowing himself to be touched in return. After the film, Julian suggested they go back to his apartment. Ignoring his lingering reservations, Connor had agreed. They drank a couple of beers once there, but it wasn't Connor's first experience with alcohol, and his head was clear enough to know what he wanted. The beer simply made it easier to admit. Once they were both buzzing, Julian pulled him to his feet and began undressing him, eyeing Connor in a way that made him feel attractive. The sex wasn't great. Connor felt like he was doing everything wrong, and once Julian came, he was no longer interested. Connor had to do the rest on his own, but he figured it was only their first time, and that they would have other opportunities to get it right. The next morning, Julian was distant and defensive. He obsessed over Connor's age, claiming that the beer had impaired his judgment. Connor reassured him that everything was fine, that he had enjoyed himself and wouldn't tell anyone. The other man thanked him, and he assumed that everything would be okay. That was the last he ever heard from Julian. Connor wasn't exactly heartbroken, but the knowledge that his first time had been with someone unimportant, someone he had known for all of 6 hours, had taken the shine off an already mediocre experience. Now he looked back on that night with disgust. Connor tried a few more times after that, meeting other guys and being more cautious with his impulses. He soon realized that these men were also only interested in casual hookups. Connor wondered if his age was the issue. He could understand why an adult wouldn't want to date a teenager, so he began lying about his age. All this did was make the men more honest about what they wanted. No more pretending to care about him. They got right to the point. Connor only slept with a few other guys, simply because they were hot and he was horny, before he worried that it would become a habit. He didn't want to become like them. And he hadn't. Not yet. Connor could still remember that feeling in the movie theater, as if the fantasy world he always dreamt of had become real. Everything was possible in that moment, even if nothing had come of it. David probably felt that way tonight. Connor was sure that the kiss, clumsy and uncertain, had been one of his first. David was probably still floating along on a blissful cloud buoyed by romantic optimism. Connor intended to keep him afloat as long as possible. And if he was lucky, maybe David could help him find his way back to a place that he once thought lost.